Welcome to The Knowledge. The Knowledge, a Levitt Group podcast. Advanced knowledge for senior marketers. The Knowledge is a podcast of the Levitt Group, a sector interest group for senior marketers within the Chartered Institute of Marketing. To find out more about us, visit our website at www.levittgroup.org.uk or read the show notes for this podcast. Hello and welcome to episode 10 of The Knowledge. I'm your host, Peter Domican. On this week's podcast, I'm talking to Benjamin Pring from Cognizant about his book written in conjunction with his colleagues Malcolm Frank and Paul Roehrig, What to Do When Machines Do Everything, How to Get Ahead in a World of AI, Algorithms, Bots and Big Data. Welcome to the podcast, Ben. Perhaps you could introduce yourself and your colleagues.
So I'm Ben Pring. I run Cognizant Centre for the Future of Work. Cognizant's a large IT services and consulting company, and within that group, within the company, I run this group, which is really, I suppose, the best way to think about it is it's a think tank looking at a little bit further down the road at how new technologies are going to change, work at a sort of big picture level, how our clients that we work with, companies we work with are going to, seize advantage of the incredible new tools that are being created, but most fundamentally deploy them in important parts of their business. So, it's a group of people who tend to come from industry analyst backgrounds, Gartner, Forrester, things like that. I'm an ex-Gartner guy. I was in Gartner for 15 years, talking about cloud and multi-tenancy and next-generation IT solutions. And there's about 10 of us in the group now. And the book that we've written recently called What to Do When Machines Do Everything was written with a couple of colleagues of mine, a guy called Paul Roehrig, who works in the centre, and then also a guy called Malcolm Frank, who's the Executive Vice President of Strategy and Marketing for Cognizant.
I think it's fair to say that anybody working today is working in an environment of huge technological change. But what specifically is artificial intelligence, and how does it differ from what's come before?
No, that's a great question, Peter. I mean, AI has obviously been developing for a long period of time, and people who are familiar with the AI story, which goes back, basically 40 years or so, to the first people who were thinking, maybe even longer, 50 years, thinking about what the world would be like when machines could replicate human levels of performance. People who are familiar with that story will know that there's been, lots of highs and lows, trails of tears, lots of sort of cul-de-sacs and false dawns, and in the jargon, lots of AI winters when the promise of spring and summer hasn't really delivered. But what's really happened in the last few years is that a lot of the theoretical work that was done on AI is becoming real and becoming material, predominantly for one reason, which is, without getting into sort of the technicalities of it too much, AI is based on, really at its most fundamental level, on reinforcement learning. So you tell an algorithm to try and achieve a result, and when it achieves the result, you kind of reward it. You say right. When it doesn't, you say wrong. And AI really has taken off now because we can throw so many examples and so many moments of reinforcement at it. And the reason for that, in turn, is because of the notion of the explosion of data that's occurred in the marketplace in the last few years. So an AI algorithm can be trained on a huge data set now, and through the reinforcement learning can begin to figure out an end result that's material. So the theory has been around for a long time. Now, because of the volumes of data, the theory can actually become tested, improved, refined, and relevant in a business context. And that's the real story of why AI, we think, is so fundamental to the next wave of, pretty much everything, of certainly of business, so many aspects of society. AI is going to be absolutely central to that. And again, that's why we've written this book.
So could you give us some examples of how specifically it's starting to impact the workplace?
Perhaps the most really commercially impactful at the moment is in the financial services area, and particularly in the stock trading area. We start off in the book talking about the fact that 8 of the top 10 hedge funds in the US in 2016 were algorithmically traded funds. So, think about that for a moment. It's sort of mind-blowing when you think about that. It's basically saying in the most sophisticated high end of the financial services marketplace, where people make trillions of dollars, billions of dollars on trades and on very, very sophisticated human-based analysis, that is now being replaced commonly, without any doubt, by machines, by software-based trading. So that's a huge, huge implication. And for people, again, who know that world, they'll be familiar with the fact that big firms like Goldman Sachs are basically getting rid of traders. The traders and the sort of archetypal kind of movie-based version of open outcry and people in funny jackets, funny-colored jackets. That world is going away. I mean, it's pretty much gone away already. And it's being replaced by PhDs in computer science, and particularly in machine learning and broader aspects of AI. I think I saw a quote the other day saying that Goldman Sachs now, a third of its staff is programmers. Another area we point out in the book, which is perhaps a little bit behind financial services, but is certainly growing enormously at the moment, and arguably, perhaps unarguably more important than financial services, is in healthcare, where again machines are besting people in reading all sorts of diagnostic information, particularly in MRI readings and things like that, where machines can beat human levels of performance. So there's a number of studies that have shown that human rates of positive identification run in the high 80%, and there is software being deployed in a number of American hospitals at the moment where the machine success rate is in the high 90s.
So just as we see automation taking over in a factory environment, we're starting to see a similar thing, but in situations that previously we thought work that only could have been done by a highly skilled professional.
That's right, yeah. No, the sort of the force of automation, which has obviously changed the kind of blue-collar physical production world in the last 40 years. I mean, look at how any modern car is made nowadays. Huge amounts of automation and robotics and in those for factory production lines. No, the same dynamic is going to occur over the next generation or two in the bourgeois, white-collar, sort of office-based world. That's absolutely right. And so that's really what our book is about, is, what do you do in this environment, and how do you take advantage of that and mitigate the downside and the risks of that.
What are the skills that are easily automated and which are the skills that aren't? So in a crude way, who are the winners and losers?
Really, you can look at a continuum of jobs and skills and tasks. And simplistically put, the more repetitive, the more rote, the more routine a task is, the more susceptible it's going to be to AI-based replacement. And conversely, the more creative, the more complex, the more multidiscipline-based skills and jobs they'll be susceptible to less levels of automation. The crucial distinction, and obviously there's a lot of angst in the marketplace around these ideas at the moment, and a lot of professional people are waking up and are concerned that their job as a lawyer or as a doctor or a teacher is going to kind of suddenly be replaced by machines. The way of really breaking that misconception, because it is a misconception, is to recognize that all jobs consist of tasks. And not all jobs are going to be replaced by software, but in a lot of jobs, lots of tasks are going to be replaced by software. So, to try and make this a bit more straightforward, think about your own job as a journalist, a commentator, a management consultant. There are lots of elements of your job which you could use automation-based tools and AI-based automation-based tools to improve your job, to make your job easier, quicker, more effective, more efficient, hopefully more satisfying for you personally. But the notion that AI is going to replace, your job entirely or my job entirely anytime soon is sort of a misreading, is frankly kind of ludicrous. The machine is going to replace those routine, rote elements of your job. The job itself will change, will morph, will be a different type of job, different style of job in 10 years, as lawyering today is probably quite different from 30 years ago or 20 years ago.
I think some of the concerns of that at the moment, that we're in a period where a lot of people are working longer and productivity and wage growth is low. You've looked at the history of that and you said that we're on the verge of a big breakout. Could you tell us about that?
Well, if you put this into a historical context, which we do, in our book, in a relatively, brief fashion, just to give people that sort of sense of how things unfold, to give some historical parallels. Each big wave of economic growth, starting from, the invention of the first machine, if you like, sort of back into the 18th century, back into the sort of invention of the spinning jenny and the loom, and think about the impact that had on sort of Cottonopolis in Manchester. Each big wave of economic growth has been driven by a new machine, the invention of a machine. So that first wave was the loom. The second wave was a steam engine. The build out of the incredible sort of rail network in England and then all around the world. And that was the source of a huge growth in economic growth for individuals, for the country in GDP terms at a macro level. And then the third sort of big economic wave would be the industrialization of the sort of steel era, the building, the invention of the ability to create sort of bridges, tunnels, skyscrapers, all based on the ability and the machinery to put this sort of completely new fabric into society. And so we're beginning to think that really the IT revolution, everybody listening to this today has worked in the information revolution, the information age for their entire year. Last year was the 70th anniversary of the first commercial computer, the ENIAC, and just developed at the end of the Second World War. But in a way, and again, that historical sort of parallel demonstrates this quite clearly, is that these waves take a long time to really break and crest and really change society. And so we've been using computers for a long period of time, but we think that that's almost just the preamble. The PCs and the IBM 360s and the AS400s that we've used have really just been very crude, early stage tools. And now we're getting to the point where, going back to AI, injecting this into the story, the new machine, what we call systems of intelligence in our book, is really going to profoundly change society and profoundly distribute growth opportunities far beyond Silicon Valley or Silicon Fen or Silicon Roundabout. Because what's going to happen, Peter, we believe, is that these tools, these productivity tools, again with AI at their heart, are going to be tools that doctors and lawyers and teachers and policemen and every job in society can use to upgrade their job. And again, without going into too much of the sort of historical parallel, I mean, the robber barons in America of 110 years ago, the Carnegies, the Vanderbilts, they created the technologies and they sort of became immensely wealthy in doing that. But as those technologies seeped out into society, into American society, into British society, there was a huge growth of opportunity and wealth for vast parts of society. And that's the point we think we're at again now, where the tools that have been invented by the Google guys, Jeff Bezos, Zuckerberg, the modern robber barons, if you like, those tools now are going to be used by you and me and people listening to this podcast, and we're going to inject them into the work we do, the work that matters for us in the society, in the towns and the cities we live in. And we're going to create incredible growth because we're going to make things better. We're going to make our jobs better. We're going to make healthcare outcomes better. We're going to make financial services, wealth, security more broadly distributed, because these new machines are going to help us to do things more productively, faster, quicker, cheaper, and ultimately better.
So essentially we have a choice. We can wait to be eaten up, if you want to put it in those terms, or we can try and get ahead of the curve.
That's exactly right, yeah. I mean, that's why our book is subtitled How to Get Ahead in a World of AI, Algorithms, Bots, and Big Data, because we think absolutely that's right. It's we as individuals and we as collections of individuals in companies or in societies, we have a choice to make. We have decisions to make now. Ultimately, at the end of the day, these things that we're talking about, AI, they are tools, and tools need to be managed well by people. Any fool with a tool. So some companies, some societies will manage these tools well for their advantage, incredible productivity gains they will get from them. And some people won't. And part of not managing these tools well will be sticking your head in the sand, kind of ignoring them, hoping they'll go away. Or, and this is where we think the debate in the sort of zeitgeist in the media and a lot of the sort of commentary at the moment is worrying about big, broad, philosophical, ethical considerations, which really are a generation or two away, rather than worrying about what to do today. I mean, we say that there's no point really worrying about 20 years down the track. You should be worrying about the next 20 months. Because if you don't figure this out and make sense of this in whatever context you work and live in the next 20 months, realistically, you're not going to have much of a say in this in 20 years' time, because you're going to be sort of basically irrelevant to the debate. So this is a crucial moment for countries, for companies, to figure out there's this incredible new thing that's being developed. We can manage it, we can get ahead with it, or we can basically be made irrelevant by it.
It's very difficult to understand when technology really breaks and impacts society in a big way. And you could argue that some of the technology changes of the past weren't particularly thought out in terms of what people were going to do. So if you looked at things like the steel and the coal industry, you knew that they would come to an end or reach a saturation point, but there was no actual planning for that.
No, that's true. I mean, and again, this sort of gets into a broader socioeconomic debate about planned versus unplanned economies. And how societies manage these big seismic tectonic generational shifts. And, that's an interesting debate. I mean, I'd say in a sort of relatively simple way, in a sort of relatively quick fashion, that ultimately the truth of what will happen, the truth of what has always happened, and the truth of what will happen in the future is that governments and policymakers will struggle to keep up with this, and that really what will happen is the market will dictate how this develops and changes, and the interplay between supply and demand, and the interplay between commercial interests within that broad framework. And this is not plannable. I mean, these will be millions of individual decisions that you and I as consumers, as participants in the marketplace make, which will ultimately, dictate the future shape of this. So again, we have choices to make, and again, for people who are listening to this and who are interested in the broader debates about universal basic income and robotic taxation, I mean, they're very interesting discussions. We think this is, and we've written a business book for business people who want to get ahead in the current game that we're playing, rather than waiting for those bigger economic and political discussions to be, worked out. The reality is, commercially, you need to get to the Google price point, you need to get to the Amazon efficiency point, you need to get to the Facebook personalization point in whatever good or service that you're selling. And if you don't, you're not going to be around to have that discussion in a few years' time. So that's why being pragmatic, not getting too caught up in those bigger, broader discussions, we think is really the important thing that commercially focused business people need to do today.
So on the basis of trying to get ahead of the curve, we need to improve our understanding. Can you tell us a bit more about the innards of how AI works?
Obviously, within the discipline of AI, there are a number of differing subdisciplines, and people talk about different aspects of them somewhat interchangeably between neural networks, reinforcement learning, different flavors. But ultimately, they are all a variation on the same notion that algorithms with enough data, can begin to figure out the next question with an absence of human intervention. That's basically the root of machine learning, what it's all about. To get it beyond the need for human intervention in that identifying what is a good and a bad outcome. So a great example of that is the work that is coming out of King's Cross in London with the AlphaGo guys. And again, many people I'm sure will be familiar now with the story of AlphaGo beating the world's best Go player, Lee Sedol, last year. And that's a fascinating story to read that and to be sort of in the middle of that story. What's less well known is that there's another software program called Libratus, written by a couple of people from Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh here in the US, which has recently beaten 4 of the world's best poker players. And again, this is an interesting point illustrating how fast this is all developing on this sort of exponential curve, because winning at Go, people who are familiar with that what happened, were free in admitting that a lot of the actual algorithms working there were working on huge data center farms. Again, a lot of this is in the public domain now, and you can see a lot of this information, but huge infrastructure, aka brute force, and huge volumes of data to allow the deep mind, the Google algorithm, to figure this out. But what's happened in the poker example is that the volume of processing power and the volume of data was substantially reduced, much smaller footprint, technological footprint, aka it's not just brute force now, it's that the software that the Carnegie guys wrote is just getting smarter and smarter on an exponential curve, because the algorithms are beginning to figure out the next questions on their own. Now, how they do that is that's deep science and deep technical knowledge beyond the realms of 99.9% listening to this podcast and 99.9% in the world. So
certainly beyond me.
But the bottom line, the point is that there's absolutely no doubt that the quality of algorithms that are being written is growing extremely fast. That's the big point to really take away from this, Peter. That this is showing us that this is no longer kind of sci-fi. This is no longer just people, speculating philosophically. This is happening, and will be happening in a business context in a town near you very, very soon.
What do you think are the main points coming out for marketers in that?
Well, I mean, clearly the world of marketing has changed enormously, very, very quickly through technology. I mean, anybody who's sort of taken a career break from a marketing job, 5 years ago and came back to it now probably wouldn't recognize it. The range and the sophistication of tools and the very, very nature of what marketing is in a kind of 24/7, always connected, always on, socially media-driven, software-mediated customer experience. I mean, it's extraordinary, really, to think about that. And the next generation of that is going to be the injection of AI into lots and lots of different aspects of it. People who are familiar with or live in a Salesforce.com world will know what Einstein's beginning to do within their workflow. You could be cynical and say it's the sort of next generation Microsoft Clippy, where it bubbles up and makes a suggestion and says, "Have you thought about calling John? You haven't spoken to him for 36 hours. You should call this bloke. John knows Michael. Why don't you call Michael as well?" So that level of suggestion, that's going to be very, very big. I think it's going to be very profound, and it's going to change the whole end-to-end life cycle of marketing through sales, I think. Another flavor of it is going to be the sort of bot world, the sort of AI-based assistant world. There's a really interesting company some people might know called X.AI in New York, who have written software that basically can schedule meetings for you.
If we look at automation taking away what you would call some of the drudgery and the routine tasks that we have to do, how do we amplify the human performance and the human aspect of what we do?
Well, that's really, I think, the most interesting part of this. I think why a lot of people are nervous about this is because they can see what's going to go away. They can see what's going to be automated away, but they have a harder time figuring out what's sort of coming, what's going to be facilitated and allowed, what's the new things that they can do. And that notion of amplifying human performance, I think, is absolutely crucial, Peter. In fact, just to step back for a second, I mentioned the subtitle of our book earlier on, How to Get Ahead. Ahead is actually within the architecture of our book is a sort of business model, is a mnemonic. A stands for automation. We've sort of been talking about that now. H, we might come on to this in a moment, is our word that we invented in our previous book called Code Halos, where we were talking about the digital fingerprint that we're all creating through every digital interaction we have. So a halo to us is all the data swirling around us that Facebook can see, that Google can see, that the folks in Cheltenham can see, if you know what I mean. And E in our mnemonic is for the word enhancement. And that, again, to your question about amplifying human performance, that's what's really crucial to this, is that, and I sort of touched on this a little bit earlier on, is that these new tools, these new productivity tools, are going to enhance the work that you and I do. So it's going to be, you plus the technology, man plus machine, just in the way that, again, through history, the history of economic growth is the history of tools. Tools have always taken us to the next level. So, so let's go back to Amy as an example. Amy is going to enhance your performance, your job, your day-to-day life through taking away stuff that, is drudgery for you and allowing you to spend more time doing what it is that you personally enjoy most, where you can make the most contribution Because again, there's a very straight line correlation between the value add contribution that we have economically and doing something that you enjoy. I mean, I sometimes joke that the future of work is not work. You know, because remember that nice phrase, if you do something you love, you never work a day in your life. So I'm lucky enough personally to very, very infrequently work in Cognizant because I love what I'm doing. So the only time I'm working is when I'm doing my expenses because I hate doing that.
How are we going to teach our kids and ourselves to cope with this future? Because essentially we're still training people for a 1950s industrial society in many respects.
No, that's exactly right, Peter. And we share that view that the education system and the sort of the grand design of it is really lagging behind where this is going. And there are certainly people in academia, certainly teachers up and down the sort of age spectrum who recognize that and who are trying to do something about it. So everything from the sort of MOOC wave, the online courses, the Udacities, the Coursera's. There's people who are investing in new models. There are then more sort of pragmatic level, a number of school systems, certainly here in the States and probably elsewhere, who are trying to reconfigure the school system, reconfigure the experience of a kid going through their day. And we focus on feature a company in the book called New Classrooms, who are quite progressive in the way they're thinking about breaking that, as you say, that kind of factory industrial model. As for the kids, I often look at the world through the eyes of my own kids, a 17-year-old and a 15-year-old. I call them my kind of at-home future of work focus group. And I think they're sort of training themselves. I think anyone, again, who's got sort of teenagers and observes how they live, I mean, in some ways it's horrifying just how attached they are to their phones and how sort of, how they're looking at their phone the whole time. But, they've basically been learning and are learning a new world and co-creating a new world. From all of the e-gaming they're doing, they're learning and developing the new social norms of a new world, which will be different to the norms of 2017 that, a middle-aged person like myself exists with. They're going to change education. They're going to change business in very, very profound ways. And we've been seeing this, obviously, as the sort of rise of the digital natives the last 10 years or so. But those people are now increasingly present within work, within companies, setting up their own companies. And we can all see how work is changing. The way that work is done is changing. The explosion of the WeWork generation, as I call them. WeWork is a co-sharing office space company that's growing like wildfire in the States and in the UK as well. And people are working in a totally different way. And people don't want to sit in cubicles and, push paper anymore. People want to work in ways that are more enjoyable and more creative and more energizing. And so that interplay between the future and the present, there's always a tension there. But I'm very confident and very excited by the fact that even though you might think that, Johnny's wasting time killing people on Call of Duty or Snapchatting, ridiculous selfies and stuff like that. That's just a new world that's being created, and you might not be to your taste. But then, my mum didn't particularly like the Sex Pistols, 40 years ago. So, that's just the nature of change, really, isn't it? And time.
Ben, thanks very much for your time today. Where can people get hold of you and any additional resources around the book?
Yeah, no, thanks, Peter. Great talking to you. Well, my email is benjamin.pring@cognizant.com. You can find a lot of our thoughts and reports that we've written at futureofwork.com. And the book that we've just published, What to Do When Machines Do Everything, is available at Amazon and Barnes & Noble and all good bookstores near you.
We'll put links to that in the show notes. Thanks very much for your time today.
Thanks, Peter.
And that was Benjamin Pring talking about what to do when machines do everything. That's it for this episode of The Knowledge. Until next time, goodbye.